Good evening, everybody. My name is Ken Laparo, and I'm a faculty member in the Department of Electrical, Computer, and Systems Engineering at Case Western Reserve University. And it is my extreme pleasure to welcome you to today's events, a fireside chat with Vint Cerf. This event is hosted by ISACS, the Institute for Smart, Secure, and Connected Systems at Case Western Reserve University, for which I serve as the faculty director, and the CSU Tech Hub at Cleveland State University, and the IoTC, which is the Internet of Things Collaborative, which is a regional partnership between ISACS at Case Western Reserve University and the CSU Tech Hub at Cleveland State University. The Internet of Things Collaborative is driving the development and application of connected devices and systems with applications in future manufacturing, health, and smart and sensible cities. And the IoT Collaborative is supported by the Cleveland Foundation, who has also helped to make today's event possible. We are very, very grateful to the Cleveland Foundation for their support. We would also like to thank and acknowledge the Marconi Society and the Veal Institute for Entrepreneurship at Case Western Reserve University for their support of today's event. Vint Cerf, often referred to as one of the fathers of the internet, is an internet pioneer. Beginning with his foundational work on TCP/IP.
Run over here. This is probably very good.
And the development of the architecture of the internet, he has been actively engaged in the development of the internet and communication technology as we know it today, and with the continued innovations that are setting the foundation for the internet of the future. Vint has received numerous awards, including the National Medal of Technology, the Turing Award, the Presidential Medal of Freedom, and the Marconi Prize. The Marconi Prize is awarded annually to innovators who have made a significant contribution to advancing information and communications technology. Vint is a member of the National Academy of Engineering and has been serving as Google Vice President and Chief Internet Evangelist since 2005. The structure of this evening's event is that Vint will give a presentation, and at the conclusion of his presentation, we will have a question and answer session. Please submit your questions through the chat, and we will call on individuals that have submitted questions in the order in which they were received. Please keep yourself on mute for the entire program unless you are called on to speak. Without any further delay, it is my pleasure to turn the program over to Vint Cerf.
There we go. The system said I was not allowed to unmute myself, and so I was thinking this is going to be a really interesting conversation. First of all, thank you all very much for taking time this evening to engage. Case Western is not unknown to me, but it is terra incognita for the most part. So I'm really looking forward both to our discussion, but also to learning more and potentially finding collaborative things to do with the university and the programs that you have. We've already discovered in a pre-event chat that the Internet of Things is an area of very significant common interest. I've been asked to pick up on a number of topics, sort of starting with early life and education and kind of going through in a historical way some of the things that have occupied my time over the past 70 plus years. I promise you we will not literally go year by year for 70 some odd years, but I will try to pick up some of the highlights. Oh, and I should tell you that my father grew up in Ohio. He was in Cincinnati, not Cleveland, but I think he enjoyed his childhood there and eventually moved to Los Angeles after the Second World War was over, which is where I grew up. So I started at early life at Yale University in the hospital, of course, not as a student. But I moved to Los Angeles, or was moved to Los Angeles when I was 3 years old. So I grew up in California for about the first 30 years or so of my my life. Um, Most of it was in Southern California in the Los Angeles area. I ended up going to a high school called Van Nuys High. And the reason this is interesting is that it was sort of a bedroom community. This is north of Los Angeles, the San Fernando Valley. It was bedroom community for Hollywood. And so a number of relatively famous names went to that high school, like Marilyn Monroe and Don Drysdale, and the former director of the Smithsonian, and a list of other well-known people, Natalie Wood, and so on, Robert Redford. Now they weren't, and Stacy Keach, I guess, also. Now I didn't overlap with most of them, although Stacy and I did overlap for a little bit. But the other thing that's interesting about Van Nuys High is that three of the people who were very, very instrumental in the evolution of both the ARPANET and the internet were at Van Nuys High School students. My best friend, Steve Crocker, ran the network working group that did the host-to-host protocols for the ARPANET. And John Postel, whose name is legendary in the internet space, who handled all the requests for comment of the Internet Engineering Task Force and managed both IP address allocation and domain name allocation. All of that was his job. Of course, the job was much smaller in the earliest days of the internet. It was possible for one person to do that. Very rapidly as the internet grew, of course, we needed to grow the support staff and the mechanisms that permitted this to work at all. So three people, Steve Crocker, John Postel, and I all went to Van Nuys High, although we were in different classes separated by about a year apart. We met each other again at UCLA when I went there as a graduate student after finishing an undergraduate degree at Stanford in mathematics and taking all the computer science courses I could. I worked for IBM for a couple of years in Los Angeles, and then after 2 years of running a time-sharing system, which at the time in the mid 60s was relatively new, I realized that I needed to go back to school. And so I went to UCLA, started the PhD program there. And right in the middle of that whole thing, one of the faculty members, Leonard Kleinrock, who had come to UCLA from MIT, and who had done seminal work in the use of queuing theory to analyze store and forward networks, got a contract from the Advanced Research Projects Agency to do modeling and analysis of a packet switch network, which was called ARPANET. And so just by happenstance, Steve and I and John Postel were all students and went to work for Len. I was the principal programmer for what was called the Network Measurement Center. Steve ran the host-to-host protocol developments and also higher level applications like file transfer and telnet remote access. And John, of course, handled the RFCs and IP address allocation even before IP addresses existed because internet hadn't been invented. So we were deeply embedded in the ARPANET project, which demonstrated that packet switching was a powerful and useful tool for computer-to-computer communication, and perhaps more important, for different brands of computers to interoperate. Some people who've been around for a while will remember that IBM had its networking architecture called SNA. Digital Equipment Corporation had DECnet, and HP had something called DS, which I think stood for Distributed Systems. In any case, they allowed the same brand computer to interoperate, but not different brands of computers to interoperate. So after I finished my PhD at UCLA and had worked for some time, 4 years or more, on the ARPANET project, I went up to Stanford to join the faculty in 1972. And in the spring of the following year, Robert Kahn, with whom I had worked while I was at UCLA, had ended up at the Advanced Research Projects Agency and was now looking at the possibility of using computers in command and control settings. The implication of that was that the computers would end up being in mobile vehicles and ships at sea and airplanes. Well, the ARPANET project was designed around dedicated telephone circuits connecting the packet switches of the ARPANET together, and that didn't work. You can't use wires to hook the ships together because they get all tangled up. The planes never make it off the tarmac, and the tanks run over the wires and they break. So he had already started, by the spring of '73, looking at a packet mobile radio system and also a packet satellite system where one satellite channel was being dynamically shared by multiple ground stations, almost like there was an Ethernet in the sky. So he showed up in my lab at Stanford and he said, "We have a problem." And of course, my first reaction was, "What do you mean we?" And he said, "Well, look, I have this mobile packet radio thing that I'm working on, and I've got the packet satellite thing, and we've got the ARPANET. And oh, by the way, about 1.5 miles from my lab is Xerox Palo Alto Research Center. And that's where Bob Metcalf and David Boggs were building Ethernet based on ideas that they had gotten, or Metcalf had gotten from the AlohaNet project, which is another radio-based packet switch system at the University of Hawaii. And so there were 4 packet technologies, staring us in the face, which did not have common characteristics: different packet sizes, different data rates, different latencies, and different error rates. And so Bob presents this problem as, how do we make this plethora of different packet switch systems look uniform so that any computer on any network could communicate with any computer on any other network freely? And it took us about 6 months, and we ended up with the TCP protocol, which eventually was split out into TCP and IP. And we published a paper in May of 1974 in the IEEE Transactions on Communications. But I had begun doing detailed specs for the TCP protocol in January of '74, before the paper was published. And by the end of 1974, I had a team of graduate students refining the TCP protocol design. So we had a complete full spec published as RFC number 675 in December of 1974. And we promptly began implementing it in 1975 in 3 different locations: Bolton, Neck and Newman in Cambridge, Massachusetts, Stanford University, and University College London in England, which was another one of our collaborators. And we very quickly discovered, upon implementing what we had worked a year on to design, it didn't work right. And so we'd made assumptions, and there were some other just logic glitches that we didn't notice. So we went through 4 iterations of the design. And around the 3rd iteration, we realized that although the TCP protocol, which was delivering a stream of well-ordered packets, which could be seen as a stream of ordered bytes or octets, that was fine for doing things like file transfers and even terminal interactions, remote access to time-shared machines. But it didn't deal with real-time processes like voice and video and radar and things of that kind. And so we split the internet protocol out deliberately in order to handle low latency applications that did not require complete delivery of the data, but only timely delivery. It's sort of like, you don't care where the missile was. You want to know, where is it now? And so this sort of real-time application was very important in the command and control settings. So we split those out and then built the user datagram protocol on top of IP and adjacent to TCP. And of course, we borrowed from the ARPANET a lot of the protocols for application layer. We added the SMTP protocols for email. And by, I would say, about 1978 or so, we had pretty much settled on a stable design. We did a demonstration in November of 1977 showing all 3 of the networks, packet radio, packet satellite, and the ARPANET, interacting with each other with mobile vehicles up and down the Bayshore Freeway. And I have to tell you that we had this packet radio van, which SRI International put together. So no labels on it at all. It's just a plain van with no windows except in the cab, and a stacked dipole array antenna sticking up the top. And it was just full of all kinds of radio gear and computer gear and everything else. And we were using it to test mobile communications using $50,000 packet radios, which were a cubic foot in size, unlike the thing you stick in your pocket or your purse today. So at one point, the engineers are driving up and down the Bayshore Freeway, and they pull off the side of the road to do some more extensive tests on the effects of shot noise, for example, on the transmissions. And of course, the driver is an engineer, so he gets out and he goes around and gets into the back with everybody else. So some police car comes by and he notices there's an unmarked van, with a radio antenna sticking out, and nobody in the cab. So they pull around behind it and they bang on the door. We open up the door. Of course, what they see is a bunch of bearded guys with all kinds of computer gear and radios and everything else. And one of them says, "Who are you?" And one of the engineers says, "Oh, we work for the government." And the cop looks at him and he says, "Which government?" "But officer, we were only going 50 kilobits a second." So that was a very important demonstration in 1977, showing all of these various networks interacting with each other in a successful way. Ironically, as 1978 comes along, I have moved from Stanford to ARPA. I'm now the program manager for Internet, Packet Radio, Packet Satellite, Packet Security. And I am eager to get this thing actually deployed. So in order to do that, we have to take the now evolved TCP/IP protocols and the applications and get them implemented on every operating system we can get our hands on. And I can tell you there were more than 3 of them back then. So we started pushing very hard to get implementations done. And just about that time in 1978, as I'm sort of freezing everything and trying to get it implemented, in Europe, a group decides that they don't want any of this military stuff. And so TCP/IP is a bad idea, and why don't we go do our own? So they invent something called the Open Systems Interconnection model. And they begin developing a 7-layer cake worth of protocols. And for 15 years, from 1978 to 1993, there is this collision between the OSI initiative and the TCP/IP effort. And eventually, of course, TCP/IP wins, but it was certainly not a slam dunk. Since the OSI work was being done by the International Standards Organization, a lot of countries around the world, including the US, concluded that they should use the protocols coming out of the international standards because that would be international standards, and why would they not do that? So it was quite a contest, but the difference between the 2 efforts is that in the internet case, we implemented first and then to make it work and then documented. The ISO guys, this is a cartoon characterization, so I don't mean to overstate this, but they mostly documented before they did any implementation. So by 1993, it was pretty clear that TCP/IP was widely available. Interestingly enough, Bob Kahn and I discussed in 1973 whether we should patent or otherwise control access to the design. And we went through a little scenario. We said, okay, if this is really going to be for command and control, it's going to have to work for our allies. So we said, okay, so who are our allies in 1973? And there was a list. And then we said, who were our allies 25 years ago? And the answer was a different list. And then we said, well, who will our allies be 25 years from then? That's 25 years after 1973. And the answer is we don't know. And we concluded that in order to be assured that the allies would have access to this technology so things would interoperate, we decided we just released the thing publicly, that we made no controls or anything. And some people have said, how the hell could you do that in the middle of the Cold War? You're doing this for the Defense Department. It's supposed to be used for the command and control system. How did you get away with that? And I think the answer is, well, we didn't ask for permission. We just did it and nobody noticed. By 1993, though, another thing is noticed, and that's the World Wide Web. Now, Tim Berners-Lee releases that in December of '91. And nobody really notices except for a couple of guys at the National Center for Supercomputer Applications, which was an NSF-funded activity. And they decide, Mark Andreessen and Eric Bina decide to build a graphical version of the browser, which Tim Berners-Lee had developed in a text-based form and released in 1991. So in '93, we started seeing the Mosaic Browser, and everybody saw the internet now as a very colorful thing, looked like a magazine with formatted text and imagery and eventually streaming audio and video. And that took the world by storm. It was a whole new layer on the original protocols, HTTP and pages written in HTML. And that led to the development of a company on the West Coast called Netscape Communications, which was founded by Mark Andreessen and by the guy who had founded Silicon Graphics. So they started their work in 1994. They went public in 1995, and the stock went through the roof. And that was the beginning of the dot boom. And of course, the Silicon Valley investment community started throwing money at anything that looked like it might be part of the internet. And that worked really well. Lots of money was invested until around April of 2000. And then a lot of the companies that were started suddenly went bankrupt or bust because they didn't notice the difference between capital and revenue. Revenue is supposed to keep coming. Capital is typically finite. So they ran out of capital and they didn't have any revenue, so they went bust. But in spite of that, some companies survived. Google got started in 1998 and it was doing okay in 2000, as were a number of others. So the internet continued to grow at a fairly rapid pace. I should also mention to you that the internet's arrival in the commercial sector was also kind of an interesting phenomenon. In 1988, it was not permitted to use any of the government-sponsored backbones, the NSFNet backbone, the ARPANET, the NASA Science Internet, and the ESNet, Energy Sciences Network from DOE. None of those were allowed to carry commercial traffic. And I remember thinking, how the heck am I ever going to get this in the hands of the general public if I can't use those backbones to show to the private sector that there is a business to be had? So I asked permission to hook up the MCI mail commercial email system, which I built for MCI in the early 1980s, to the internet as an experiment to see whether or not it would work or could be made to work. And of course, my purpose was to break the appropriate use policy and allow this commercial traffic to flow on the backbones. They let me do that. And they said, well, you can do that for a year as an experiment. So in '89, we turned on this connection. Immediately, all the other commercial email suppliers who had their own walled gardens, On Time from TimeNet and Telemail from Telenet and so on, said, well, wait a minute, those MCI guys can't have this special permission. We want to connect too, which they did. They got permission to do that. And then two things happened. First of all, they discovered that everybody in their walled garden could talk to all the other walled gardens because they were going through the internet and using the common protocols of the internet email system. And the second thing that happened is 3 commercial internet service providers popped up in 1989. One of them was UUNet here in Virginia, another one was PSINet also here in Virginia, and the third one was SurfNet out in San Diego. And there's it's spelled CERFnet, and there's a whole story behind how that happened. I didn't own it or run it or anything. But so by 1989, we're starting to see commercial service as well as commercial equipment from companies like Cisco and Juniper eventually that started way back in the 1984 period. So by 1994, and certainly, I'm sorry, by the turn of the century, by 2000, the World Wide Web is exploding, and everyone is pouring content into the network. In fact, there's so much content that nobody can find anything. And this is sort of what drove the search engines. Alta Vista was one of the earliest ones, and then Yahoo, and then Google and Bing, and so on. So by the time 2007 rolls around, the internet and the World Wide Web have become bigger and bigger businesses. And then Steve Jobs comes along and he announces the iPhone. And suddenly 2 technologies, which had been completely independent of each other, were merged. And I want to emphasize this because Marty Cooper is the guy that invented mobile telephones. Way back, starting in 1973, at the same time Bob and I are starting to work on the internet. And he takes 10 years, just like we did. He turns on his mobile phone system in 1983, while we turn on the internet January 1st, 1983. And a friend of mine who bought one of those big Motorola bricks, it was a 2.5 or 3.5 pound mobile phone, and called me and said, I got to show you something. So I went to lunch with him, and he has this thing sitting on the lunch table. And I said, what's that? And he says, the phone. And I said, well, where are the wires? And he says, there aren't any. And I said, well, how does it work? And he says, well, we talked about it. And he says, I don't know the answer to that. Why don't you call the guy that invented it? So I pick up the phone and I call Marty Cooper, whom I'd not ever met. And one of the questions I asked Marty was, how long does the battery last? And he says, Oh, about 20 minutes, but you can't hold it up longer than that. It's so heavy. Well, Marty has now become a fast friend. He's another Marconi fellow. But what's interesting is that at the point where Steve Jobs brings the mobile phone together with the internet, we see two technologies that are mutually reinforcing. And as something I want you to take away from this discussion is, well, right now it's a monologue, but I'll try to turn it into a discussion. But what I want you to take away is how important it can be to see technologies being mutually reinforcing. It's a more than linear effect. And so the mobile phone, smartphone, has been a very important fixture. And when you think about it, it's only been, what, 13 years since those appeared on the horizon. And now look how prevalent they are and how deeply dependent we are on them. So let me just add one other thing, and then we should go on to either some of the other things that you wanted me to talk about, or if I've rattled on too long, we can go on to Q&A. I'll leave it to you. I also wanted to point out that the social media have also entered into this equation relatively recently. And they have created their own set of both benefits and deficits. The most significant is that we wanted to drop the barrier for access to internet-related services so that anybody who wanted to invent new applications could do so. We wanted a very transparent system that was very end-to-end, allowing the intelligence and the application space to be operated at the edges of the net and not buried inside. And that was a really smart move because it meant every time a new technology came along, we could sweep it into the internet and have the packets run uniformly over it. And since the network didn't know what the packets were carrying, it didn't know anything about applications. So if you wanted to invent a new application, you could do it at the edges of the net and the network didn't have to change. And those two pieces of ignorance about the IP layer of protocol really set up the internet for this ability to ingest new technology and to support new applications. But now we get to social media and we see the kind of amplifying effect that social media have. Feedback loops, how many tweets, how many followers do you have, how many people watched your video, how many likes did you get? And some of those metrics drive extreme expression because people want attention, and sometimes attention is what you get by saying and doing and showing extreme things. And so we've seen the consequences of that. Figuring out how to cope with that is a huge challenge, and it is probably one of the biggest policy issues that I face on a regular basis. So let me pause for a moment. There were several other topics that I was asked to get to, but I realized I rattled on for half an hour already. What would you like to do? I can touch on the others perhaps a bit more briefly, if you wish.
Yeah, I think Vint, it would be good if you could touch on the other topics. We still have plenty of time in this particular part of the session, so please go ahead.
Okay, so the next topic has to do with accessibility of these technologies for people with disabilities. I wear two hearing aids. I've been wearing them since I was 13. I was born with this problem, but it wasn't evident. This is a successive nerve loss. And so I lose about a dB a year, but the hearing aids get better about a dB a year. So my hearing has been kind of flat. And so I've survived in a normal hearing environment. I do these conferences and telephone calls and things like that. So I've been a huge beneficiary of hearing aid technology. But the much more interesting story is about my wife, who, when she was born with normal hearing, but when she was 3, she had spinal meningitis, and the high fever destroyed the ciliary hairs inside the cochlea, which are the things that move when the eardrum moves. And as they move, they generate nerve signals, which is interpreted by the brain as sound. So those ciliary hairs were destroyed in the spinal meningitis that she experienced. So she was profoundly deaf at age 3. The good news, of course, is that her brain had heard sound, so it already had adapted to interpreting sound, so it knew what the sounds meant. She was already speaking. She was deaf for 50 years, profoundly deaf, 95 to 105 dB down in both ears. And so she grew up going to school lip reading, raised 2 sons without ever hearing their voices. had a career as an interior designer, all of it very dependent on her eyes and ability to lip read. In fact, when we moved here to Washington in 1976, so I could join the Defense Department, I suspected that she was working for the CIA, but couldn't tell me. She was such a good lip reader. But in 1993, now 50 years after she lost her hearing, she was on the net searching for cochlear implants and discovered that there was a group doing cochlear implants up at Johns Hopkins University in Baltimore. In 1996, this was on the cusp of becoming a normal practice, but this was still somewhat experimental. But she went up there to be tested to see whether or not her auditory nerve was actually still functional. And the answer is yes, it was. So she had her first cochlear implant in 1996. It's a 45-minute operation. It's outpatient. She came home and healed for a couple of weeks. And then she went back up to Johns Hopkins to be activated, which basically means they get a speech processor. It's about the size of a mobile. And it takes signals, auditory signals into a microphone, does a Fourier transform to see which frequencies are present and with what amplitude. And then it figures out which of the 16 electrodes embedded in her cochlea should be stimulated based on the analysis of the incoming signal. And the brain then interprets that signal as sound. So she goes up there, she gets activated, they put an initial map into the speech processor, and then she picks up the phone and she calls me 20 minutes after the map gets installed. Now, we'd been married for 30 years at that point. And so this wasn't a deep conversation, but it was really amazing. And then I got home and I couldn't get her off the phone. When I got home, she'd take any calls. Now, at this point, I'm senior vice president for engineering at MCI. And so she gets phone calls from, marketing and everything. So one call comes in from AT&T. And so she picks up the phone. Oh, hello, where are you? And I say, well, I'm in Bangalore. And she's a big Indian fan. And she says, oh, well, that's, tell me more, where did you learn English? Your English is very good, blah, blah, blah. This goes on for about half an hour. And this poor soul, of course, is trying to get us to switch to AT&T. So finally, at the end of this call, the marketing person said, so you're going to switch to AT&T, right? She says, well, no, my husband's an executive at MCI, but thanks for calling. And then then she decides that she needs to hear sounds or words that she hasn't heard. And so she calls the library. Remember, no, she's on the phone. Calls the library and says, can I sign up for recorded books for the blind? And they say, oh, sure, no problem. Name, address, phone number. Then they say, now you're blind, aren't you? And she says, no, I'm deaf. And there's this long pause while they're trying to figure out how the hell is that going to work? She ends up listening to 500 books on tape and now knows accents and mispronounced words and all kinds of things. But no decibel will go undetected. So she also gets a little microphone with a wire that plugs into her speech processor. And when she's going on a tour of a museum or something, she just clips the microphone through the other person's blouse or lapel. So she hears really good quality sound because the mouth isn't very far from the microphone. She even knows the word signal to noise ratio. She's an artist, but SNL means something to her. SNR rather. So SNL is something else. So then she gets an FM transmitter receiver. So when she goes to a lecture, she can hang the transmitter around the neck of the speaker and she could be 150 feet away and get perfect sound. She gets patch cords so she can plug into her Sony Walkman, or she can plug into the airplane seat to listen to the movies on the airplanes. And the good part about that is the only sound she's getting is coming out of the movie jack. And she's not hearing the 2-year-old who's screaming 2 seats away because she's getting no acoustic input. She got an optical receiver, well, I mean, just all kinds of accessory devices. So this has turned out to be simply game-changing. She got a second implant in 2006, so she was getting binaural. And then one of the implants failed in 2018, late in 2018. She had a third implant, which is much even more modern equipment. And that has been so effective that her brain has adapted to the third implant better than it did to either of the others. She can now listen to fairly complex music. I mean, Bach toccatas and things like that, whereas before they sounded like garbage disposals. Now she enjoys classical music. So this technology is spectacular. And what I hope it will happen is that ocular implants and maybe spinal implants will be possible so that people who have motor impairments or visual impairments can be helped with these kinds of sensory neural interfaces. So that's one angle on neural, electronic and neural interfaces. The other angle, though, and the one which I hope you also care a lot about, is that we have done very poorly as software programmers making our software useful for people with various kinds of disabilities, whether it's a range of visual disability, a range of auditory disability, or a range of motor disability. And the reason that we have not done very well, in spite of the fact that computers are the most adaptable things ever invented, is that the programmers who write the software and the user interfaces and everything don't have much intuition about what is needed by someone who has a disability. Moreover, because all of these disabilities are spectra as opposed to very pinpoint things, you need very adaptable software in order to meet the needs of a person with a disability. So at Google, I'm a big proponent of working on this, and although we still have a ways to go, we are making progress on improving the user interfaces. But those of you who care about this, could help us a lot by helping us get deeper intuitions into what makes a difference for people with a disability. Internet of Things is a big deal, switching topics now, and I know it's a huge focus of attention for you. I want to emphasize how important that is to me as well. I worry about software in general, not just machine learning and our AI, but just autonomous software that makes decisions that we offer, autonomy to. And so imagine all the little devices that qualify as IoT, they're full of software, and they do stuff. And we assume that they're going to do the right thing, and often they don't. And when they don't, all kinds of bad things can happen. I mean, some of the worst case examples, of course, are medical equipment that malfunctions and kills you, or a self-driving car that goes berserk. But there are other things that just don't work and they become very annoying, like heating, ventilation, and air conditioning. What about security? I worry that the community that makes IoT devices isn't paying enough attention to security, safety, and reliability. And this is something I think we need to emphasize over and over again to companies and people who make that equipment, particularly when it's going to have some longevity, like 30-year lifetime, because it's a major piece of equipment like the heating or ventilation or air conditioning system, or even household appliances that often last for 10 or more years. So paying attention to longevity and the ability to update the software safely and securely is very important. And unfortunately, the economics of these things often drive the makers to do the wrong thing. So they'll go to an open source library and grab an operating system and throw it into the device and then sell it, paying no attention to long-term maintenance or possibility of that software having bugs that are vulnerable, make it vulnerable and therefore exploitable. So we have a huge moral and technical obligation to do a better job with IoT software, in my opinion. We could come back to that if you like. The next topic, there are three. There's opportunities and challenges in digital health. There's the interplanetary network, and there's recommendations for students on career and life. Three things that we should be able to dispose of in 5 minutes, right? With regard to digital health, the COVID-19 pandemic has absolutely laser focused us on remote medicine. My experience with COVID-19, which I had in March of last year, was fortunately mild in terms of symptoms, but I ran into the problem where my family doctor said, don't come into the office. And I said, I'm sick, I want you to look at me. I don't want you in my office, why not? I don't have any protective gear and I don't want to get COVID-19. And I said, but what about me? And so the answer was, well, we'll be happy to do a video call. And I'm sitting here thinking, what kind of medicine is that? You didn't get my pulse rate, you didn't get my temperature, you didn't get, any of the normal things that you'd expect to get if you walked into an office visit. So this led me to conclude that IoT devices for purposes of doing this sort of health evaluation would be very valuable and important. And of course, even after the pandemic is over, this could turn out to be really helpful for doing remote medicine in places that don't have clinics or don't have a very high population of doctors, to say nothing of being able to get consults from specialists who might otherwise not be available. Now, there's some, in the background, you should be thinking, yeah, that's really helpful, but what about the insurance companies? And can you be licensed to practice in a state where you aren't licensed, but your patient is in some other state? What do we do about that? And I think there's a bunch of adaptation that's going to happen, not only for technical reasons, but for legal and economic reasons. So there's a long road to hoe here to taking advantage of what we have now learned about digital, maintaining people's health with devices that can do continuous monitoring, which is one other observation worth making. When you think about it, most people, guys especially, don't go into the doctor until they're sick. And so their doctors get the impression they're sick all the time because that's the only time they ever see them. Whereas continuous monitoring can tell you something about the state of a person's health, over a period of time, which goes up and down. That helps you detect when things are different than normal. And so continuous monitoring can turn out to be super helpful. A quick riff on the interplanetary network. The work started in 1998 at the Jet Propulsion Laboratory after the landing of the Pathfinder, which in 1996 was the first successful Mars landing after the 1976 Vikings. The 20-year period in between, nothing worked. So everybody was very excited. So I got together with the team at JPL in the following year, and we said, what should we be doing now in 1998 to be ready for that which will be needed 25 years from now? And we concluded that we should build an interplanetary extension of the internet. And so we started doing the design work, and we said, well, TCP ought to work on Mars. It worked okay on Earth. And then we started doing the math for interplanetary distances, and the whole thing collapsed. When you think about it, between Earth and Mars, when we're closest together, it's 35 million miles, 3.5 minutes one way by radio at the speed of light, 7 minutes round trip time. And when we're farthest apart, it's 235 million miles. It takes 20 minutes one way, 40 minutes round trip time. Try to do TCP flow control with a 40-minute round trip time. It's like driving a car with a 30-second delay. You turn the wheel, 30 seconds later, the car moves. So that didn't look good. Oh, and there's this other problem. The planets are rotating and we don't know how to stop that. So if you're talking to something on the surface and it rotates out of view, you can't talk to it until it comes back around again. Same problem with satellites. So we said, okay, we have a delay and disruption tolerant problem here. We designed a whole new suite of protocols starting in 1998. By 2004, we had prototypes ready just as the landers, Spirit and Opportunity, as rovers, landed on Mars in January of 2004. And as soon as they landed, they started trying to transmit data back to Earth from the surface of Mars using an antenna that would speak to the deep space network. These are big 70-meter dishes that are in 3 locations around the Earth, and the radio's overheated. So immediately, the team says, well, we got to shut down the radios or reduce the duty cycle. Well, they were only capable of 28 kilobits a second anyway. And so the scientists are now really grumpy. Somebody says, hey, we still have X-band radios on the rovers and we have X-band radios on the orbiters. What if we reprogram the rovers and the orbiters with our prototype interplanetary software to do store and forward through the orbiters? So when the orbiters come overhead, the rover sends data up, it hangs onto it till it gets to the right place in its orbit, and then transmits the data back to the deep space net. Well, guess what? The X-band radios can run on 128 kilobits a second because the orbiters are much closer than Earth. And the orbiters are out of the atmosphere with bigger solar panels, so they can transmit data at 128 kilobits back to the Earth Deep Space Network. So we got 4 times more data rate by going through store and forward. That's been running since 2004. Since that time, we've refined the protocols. We've been through 4 iterations. They're now standardized by the Consultative Committee on Space Data Systems. They're running on the International Space Station. We've offered them free of charge to anyone who wants them. We have the European Space Agency, JAXA in Japan, and the Korean Space Agency are all using them in experimental modes right now. We hope that they'll be adopted and used in the Artemis program, Return to the Moon, that the US has launched, or is in the process of launching. So interplanetary is real, and we're very excited about it unfolding. Last point about this is that as the spacecraft go out to do scientific missions, when they finish those missions, if they're still functional, they have software or have computing capability, communications capability, and the like, we can reprogram to be nodes of an interplanetary backbone. So we'll literally grow this thing, mission by mission over time. So by the end of the century, we should have a fairly robust interplanetary backbone to serve the manned and robotic space exploration programs. So I have two recommendations for students. The first one is that while you're still young, it's okay to take risks because you are young enough to recover from failure. So don't be scared about doing something risky. I mean, don't jump out of the 10th floor window to see if gravity works. That's stupid. But taking risks in your work, career, and research all makes sense, especially as you're young. So take the risky road early on. The second observation I would make is, in my experience anyway, that it sometimes takes decades to get some things to happen. I mean, you think about starting internet in 1973. We don't turn it on until 1983. The World Wide Web comes in 1993. The mobiles, smart mobiles, come another 10 or 15 years later. So sometimes patience and persistence really count when you want to do something big. And the second corollary to that is that you can never do something big all by yourself. And so you need to learn how to sell your ideas to get other people to help you do what you want to do. And I can tell you that learning to sell ideas has been really important in my career to get other people to help me do things that I couldn't possibly do only on my own. So I'll stop there. We still have some time left, and I'm happy I see a whole bunch of questions here. Should we just take them in the order that they showed up in the chat?
So Nick, how do you want to handle these?
Yeah, if you want to handle the ones in the chat, and then as people are ready to ask questions, they can add additional questions to the chat, and we can call on some people to interact as well and read out their question.
So to save time, I'm going to pretend that everybody can see the chat. Is that a reasonable assumption? So I don't.
Yeah, they can.
Yes.
Okay, so so the question here gets to the dark web and more generally just all the various bad things that people can do with this essentially neutral system, which was designed to be neutral. It can be used and abused like a lot of other devices and tools. A hammer can pound a nail and it can pound a head, and the decision about which it's going to pound is a human decision, not a decision by the hammer. Same is generally true with the internet. And so the hard part here is figuring out how to build guardrails into the way in which these things are used, how to create a regulatory environment which doesn't destroy people's freedom and flexibility to make use of the net, but at the same time protects people from harm. It's going to require a lot of international agreements and cooperation, which is what the Secretary General of the UN has already initiated. He's got he had a commission on digital cooperation, which I served on. We turned in a report in 2019. In 2020, effort was made to create a roadmap towards digital cooperation. And now the process is underway to try to explore how we can work together on a national or international basis in order to preserve all the utility of the internet while we try to protect people from potential hazards. Some technologies will help, and certainly teaching users will help. The two-factor authentication, for example, and don't click on random stuff that shows up in your inbox. By the way, if something shows up saying, click here, this is fantastic, and you get it from somebody you know, it appears to come from somebody you know, first of all, don't click on it. And second, instead of just throwing it away, forward it to your friend that it appears to come from and say, did you send this? P.S. Don't click on anything. And that will solve two things, because first it'll tell you it might have come from your friend. It might be perfectly okay. On the other hand, if it didn't, then your friend might know that their account's been compromised. So that's a good practice to consider. So there's still a huge amount of work to do to get more internet out there. Only about half the world is online, and to get it out there in a way that's safe and secure and preserves privacy and keeps people from harm. So this has technical and policy implications, and I spend a lot of my time these days on that topic. Next question comes from Mark Beno. I hope I said that right. Let's see. It's been compromised by those who desire profit at all costs, search engines that take you to whoever spends the most. That's partly true, but we should talk about that. Means for corrupt actors to feed echo chambers. Yeah, we worry about that. As everybody's right. So the real question here is, A, what were you thinking? And B, what are you going to do about it?
Right.
So, of course, I didn't anticipate some of these things. I mean, looking back, you might think you could have. But I was so focused on trying to make this accessible and useful to everybody and uniform and transparent and, equal access wherever possible, not knowing what all the applications might be. So now we have to go back and try to figure out what to do. Incentives are the key here. We have to create incentives that lead to the kinds of behaviors that we are looking for. And here I would urge all of you to think a bit about that. If you see behaviors that you don't like, just beating somebody up doesn't often work very well. You have to create an incentive for different behaviors. Sometimes that's legal constraints. Sometimes that's monetary incentives. Sometimes it's just public shaming. I'm not sure that we should bring back public flogging or anything. But we are looking for incentives, corporate incentives, financial incentives, legal incentives, moral incentives to steer people in the right direction. And so if you have ideas about that, please, you should pursue them. Grace Hopper was the one that said it's easier to ask for forgiveness than it is to get permission. So thanks to Andy Weaver for reminding me about that. Let's see. Now we're looking at a comment from Chip Kennedy. Let's see, social media, everybody seems to be worried about this. What's our role? What's the internet's role in democratization?
Mm-hmm.
How do we assure that this benefits society and doesn't cause harm? I think we're back in the same set of questions. I'm really glad that so many of you are concerned about that, as you should be. But the important part is not only framing the question, but also coming up with some answers. And we're back to incentives again. Ernest Eich says it's been 20 years since Napster broke the music industry and 20 days since Reddit broke the stock market. Let's see. What industry could be the most vulnerable right now without knowing it? I will tell you that the IoT space may be the next place where lots of potential traps could occur, especially if the people who make those devices and persuade people to use them don't pay attention to all of the issues of safety, security, and reliability, and interoperability, by the way.
Yeah.
People buy stuff from all kinds of different sources, and the internet design was intended to allow multiple sources to interwork. We're not there with the IoT space because there isn't enough agreement on what should be interoperable, and we need to work on that because otherwise people will be very disappointed. Casilda says, what are your favorite technologies that may be ready to reinforce each other? Boy, that's an interesting question. I would guess, I mean, there are many, but the thing which I think is interestingly important is cryptography. And I don't want you to come away thinking I think cryptography is the solution to all of the challenges in the internet, just like blockchain is not the solution to everything. But cryptography used in various ways can confer very strong authentication and also an ability to detect modifications that were not intended. And so I believe that hardware reinforcing security mechanisms that embody various cryptographic methods, public key and also symmetric key, can be really powerful if we can figure out how to get them in place in a way which is uniformly accessible to the people who are building on top of that. So that's certainly not necessarily the most important thing in terms of mutual reinforcement, but I have to say hardware reinforced security is, in my mind, a big deal. Too much focus on security and not on the hardware can lead to some real problems because we've discovered hardware does not always do what it says it's doing. Sometimes it does more than it said it was doing, and you don't know that until later somebody exploits it. Let's see what Zubair says. IoT and interplanetary scale networks mature, blend of older and less capable devices and more modern stuff. what are the pain points? Oh, well, bless your heart for that. Well, I have this giant rant, which we didn't talk about, called digital preservation. And it's all about the fact that software stops working after a while and things that were encoded in some particular way no longer are accessible because the software doesn't run on any current modern operating system. So I'm very worried about that, a digital dark age problem. This same phenomenon, this shifting out from under us of things that work, suggests that we really need to invest in anything we can to extend the lifetime of existing hardware. My wife and I have Teslas, and one of the interesting things about the cars is that for the most part, Musk keeps upgrading their functionality without our necessarily having to take the car in to get additional hardware. And so, you get in and the car says, guess what I can do today that I couldn't do yesterday? And of course, my next question after that is, please assure me you can still do the stuff I was relying on yesterday in addition to the new stuff that you're doing. But this software, I think, and software-enabled equipment may turn out to be part of the solution, even though it's also part of the problem. Let's see, Madison. Let's see, confidence in software without putting resources into testing and maintenance. Yeah, it's a big headache. Let's see, how do you think we can best educate our communities about software errors? Well, I'll tell you what, for those of you who care about software, operating systems, programming languages and the like, you should be thinking, how do I build programming environments that will expose stupid mistakes before they actually get out into software that's been deployed? I mean, I almost want a little piece of software that sits on my shoulder and it's watching while I'm writing the code. And it says, you just created a buffer overflow. What do you mean a buffer overflow? It says, look at line number 32. Oh, several bad words occur to me. I really want software that will help me uncover these problems. There also might be ways of making assertions about invariants that the program, if the invariants are maintained during the course of execution of the program, that might be an assurance that it doesn't have bugs that are exploitable. An ability to look at yourself while you're executing, for example, could turn out to be very powerful. But we need not only to have the tool sets, but we have to have people willing and feeling responsible for using those tools in order to assure better resistance to the kinds of exploitation that we have seen so far. I realize it's 1 minute past the hour. We've not answered all the questions. I could attempt to answer them in email. I won't be able to answer in quite the lengthy way that I've been boring you earlier, but I'd be happy to try to do that as long as you will capture those and send them.
Sure. I think we can go on for a few more minutes if your schedule allows.
Absolutely. So let's go back up now to where we left off to Matthew.
You're right.
Says, what are your thoughts and views on net neutrality? Well, I was a big proponent of net neutrality, by which I meant only that the controller, the party in control of a broadband connection should not be permitted to abuse that control to undertake anti-competitive behaviors. Example, you're a company that offers video services, and maybe you do this with a fiber net or DSL or something. And you discover that you can also supply to the customer high-speed internet service. And so the customer is happy and you're happy with a new service to offer and charge for. And then you notice that your customer is using the high-speed internet service that you are offering to go watch videos from somebody else. So suddenly that's taking away business from your video service. And so, you go to your engineers and you say, can't you screw up the internet service just enough so that only the video from us works and the other people won't, so we'll move our customers back. That's anti-competitive behavior. And so my view was not that neutrality meant every packet has to be treated the same way. Of course not. Some of them need to have low latency for game playing, and some need high data rates for file transfers. But everybody should have access to the full array of services on the same terms and conditions. Sort of like it's a common carriage kind of argument. So that's one thing. Second, neutrality meant that, some people said neutrality means that you can't charge more for more usage. Well, that's not true either. In fact, the typical offerings are that at certain data rates, maximum data rates, you pay different amounts. So if I have a gigabit, I might pay maybe twice as much as somebody who has a 500 megabit connection. We both get the same service as long as there isn't congestion. But when congestion hits, I might have more priority because I'm paying more for my gigabit connection than you might be paying for your 500 megabit. So neutrality is mostly about fairness and not engaging in anti-competitive behavior. So I'm frankly hoping that the new FCC will reinstate that thinking. Now, the bad part about the instantiation in the Obama administration of net neutrality is that it used Title II of the Telecommunications Act of 1996. Title II is all about telephony, and it is just encrusted with all kinds of telephony related stuff. It's a terrible vehicle in which to achieve internet neutrality. The problem is that the Congress of the day was not in a position to rewrite the legislation to have a title specific to internet. And that may still be the case given the very fine margins between the Republican and Democratic parts of both House and Senate. But if it were up to me, I would want a new title in the Telecom Act to address specifically internet and not have to rely on the withholding of regulation by the FCC using Title II for net neutrality purposes. Okay. Oh, people on live stream can't see the chat. Okay, well then I will try to summarize a little bit. Were you always interested in tech? This is from Eric McCollum. Were you always interested in technology or saw yourself developing something such as TCP/IP in the past? Well, honestly, I thought I was going to be a scientist of some kind. By the time I was 10 years old, I knew I was going to be some kind of a scientist because at that age, I'd gotten a 7th grade algebra book and I loved it, especially the word problems because it was like an Agatha Christie story. You know, you got to figure out who's X, and I enjoyed doing that. And then I got a chemistry set at the same time that year. And my best friend and I across the street made all kinds of things, including nitroglycerin, which is stupid to do. Fortunately, we didn't blow ourselves up. But I knew I was going to be a scientist of some kind. I just didn't know what kind. And for a while, I thought I was going to be a particle physicist. But I got drawn into computing while I was at Stanford and then at IBM, and then, of course, at UCLA. And I got infected with networking while I was at UCLA. And so, you know, the path has been, once you're infected with networking, you can never get rid of it. It's a permanent condition. And it's been a wonderful career, so I have no complaints about that. Let's see. This is from Boy's iPad to everyone. Thanks for speaking with us. What did you think of hacking when it first happened, and what's your view now? Well, hacking used to be a badge of honor. At MIT, if you were a hacker, it meant you were a hell of a programmer and you'd come up with some great ideas for making something happen, you know, with the most simple possible way or in the most, you know, compressed way. Unfortunately, hacking is a term which has now been overtaken by malware and people who go after vulnerabilities and the like. The vocabulary is stuck with me. I'm often, you know, will say to somebody, man, that's a great hack for a clever piece of code. I'm very unhappy, of course, with the fact that there is code that you can hack in the negative sense of the word. That's why I'm so concerned about programmers feeling responsibility for what they do. What they fail to do is harming other people, and they should not get away with, oh, it's just a bug. I think that we've allowed programmers, including people like me, too long to get away with that, and that's no longer acceptable. You really should feel, well, and the companies that you work for should feel a responsibility for the quality of the code that you release, and should have commitments to updating and fixing bugs and all these other things. Caleb says, do you have any big security concerns with the interplanetary network? Man, oh man, do we ever. The first thing I said to the team in 1998 was that I do not want a system that has the property that a New York Times headline reads, 15-year-old takes over MarsNet. I said, this is not a headline I want to see. So we introduced into the bundle protocol, which is the moral equivalent of the internet protocol, an end-to-end security mechanism, strong authentication of all the various components, digital signatures on the bundles as they flow, a whole bunch of mechanisms like that in order to assure that the system would be more secure than the internet has proven to be. So the answer is, yeah, we were worried about that. Raghav says, how would you recommend getting involved in the policy and technology or technology side of addressing all these concerns? Absolutely, a bunch of grassroots organizations. One of them is called the People-Centered Internet. If you go to people-centered or even just people-centered.net, you will find a plethora of activities involving policymaking and getting more internet out there. The Marconi Society, which is marconisociety.org, also has activities that's mostly focused around getting more internet out there, but digital inclusion, basically. It's not just the internet, but it's the ability to make use of computing technology effectively and efficiently and safely. And so Marconi Society is another one. The Internet Society is another place where all these things come together, technology and the policy space. That's ISOC, ISOC.org, or you can just Google Internet Society. So those are three right off the bat that you could look at and become engaged, because there are plenty of opportunities for participation there. Mark says what you did was amazing. Well, Mark Bano again, just keep in mind I had a hell of a lot of help. The smart thing is go find people who are smarter than you are to help you do what you want to do. It's a great formula. And he's saying the questions were not intended to be dystopian. Well, I didn't take them that way, Mark, so don't worry about that. John Gilmore, oh my, is this the John Gilmore that said that the internet interprets damage or interprets censorship as damage and roots around it? Is that the John Gilmore that I'm talking to? If it is, he deserves a lot of credit for that wonderful observation. Anyway, he says now that everybody is in a few hundred milliseconds of everybody else, how can we best organize our activities for maximum individual freedom and maximum public benefit? Well, one of them is not to get addicted to this stuff. And that's hard, I think. And this has penetrated so deeply into our daily lives that it's hard for some people, especially now with the pandemic, where many of us stuck at home, we're in front of these TV screens, or laptop and desktop screens. And it's hard to pry yourself away. And so I would say that I've learned to practice, I've learned to adopt a practice that helps me separate myself from work. You notice I'm wearing a three-piece suit. I always wear a three-piece suit. It's been going on for 40 years now. There's a whole story behind that. But I commute 10 seconds down the stairs into the basement in the morning. And I'm wearing my three-piece suit for work. And it psychologically helps me realize I'm at work. And so and then at the end of the day, when we're done with this call, I will go upstairs and take off my three-piece suit. And the mindset is I'm not at work anymore. And for me, that's been very helpful. Being able to pull yourself away from this technology is very helpful. Let's see. Do we still have more? I can go on for a few more.
We have a little bit more time, if you don't mind.
No, I don't. This is a question from Asher Bear, which is what role should policy, federal or state, hold in the implementation of IoT? And then there's some more questions about search engines. So let's start with IoT. I think we touched on this. I believe that we need to have some standards for quality and for assurance of resistance to attack, maybe we need the moral equivalent of an underwriter's lab where you turn over your source code and it gets evaluated by this laboratory under non-disclosure agreements in order to rate some of these things in terms of their safety and reliability. Maybe there's reporting requirements that we can impose on these things. And of course, the problem is getting companies that make these things to follow those guidelines. And again, we're back to incentives again. Are there incentives that you can enforce? If you can enforce them in country, what do you do about the rest of the world? And now that leads you into discussions about international agreements and the ability to track down people who are not living up to those commitments and need to have an incentive to do so, or perhaps go out of business, or maybe even end up in jail or paying a big fine. Let's see, in your view, do search engines authentically display the diversity of the internet? Oh, well, I think the answer is largely yes. There is one thing, however, I would say the search engines don't do. If you think about how the search engines work, they crawl through the World Wide Web. Now, web pages can have embedded in them pathways into gigantic databases. Those databases have lots of content, but they are not expressed in HTML. And so the search engine does not detect what the data is. And the only way it could, I suppose, would be to have a little robot generating questions into the database in order to find out what it has in it. Better tactic is to have the database express in some form that we agree on what its contents are, what are its semantics, what does it have in it, and what can you do? So there is that issue. The other thing is that we try very hard at Google to deal with multilingual content. We handle 100 different languages now in varying quality. I mean, some languages are more obscure and there isn't very much content to index in those languages, and others are very, very proliferated. A lot of English language stuff, for example. So I think that the engines do as much as they can, but there is a lot out there that might not be indexed if it's not expressed in HTML. The last question is, as an undergraduate, how did you know to focus on a path? This was not because I was planning my career. In fact, if somebody comes up and says, how did you plan your career? The answer is, I didn't. And in fact, I don't think anybody can really. What I would say, though, is that you can pay attention to opportunity. And my whole career has unfolded as a consequence of sometimes unexpected opportunities, some of which show up as disasters. I mean, like a huge failure, and leaving you thinking the world has come to an end. But had it not been for that failure, then this other opportunity might not have popped up. And so the important thing is not the planning. The important thing is recognizing an opportunity, even if it's disguised as a disaster. Let's see, Carolyn says TCP/IP is a vast protocol, so much redundancy is protection. How did the development process work? Well, it's pretty clear that over the course of some 40 years, we discovered we didn't get it absolutely right. We went through 4 iterations. I had a team of graduate students in the first iteration during 1974. And one of them, Yogan Dalal, who was one of my graduate students, gone on to a wonderful career in venture capitalism. But Yogan was the guy, we would settle on the state diagram. It was supposed to protect the TCP from all kinds of bad things happening, packets showing up at the wrong time, things out of order. And so we think we'd gotten it all nailed and everything. And then Yogan would come back the next day with a counter example. And so if it weren't for the fact that he was such a nice guy, we all would have hated him. But we went through that, and even then, after we started the first implementation with the version that we thought was solid, we found mistakes that in logic and the like that caused us to redo the protocols. The 3-way handshake in TCP came out of a discovery that the first way of starting and ending the TCP sessions wasn't enough. Didn't have enough protection against packets showing up with at the wrong time with the right serial number on it. So it took a long time. And since that time, especially in the flow control space, there's been an enormous amount of work to improve the quality of flow control. Since that time at Google, there's another protocol called QUIC, which binds together TCP and TLS in a way that allows for rapid recovery from failed connections. And so there's less to go through in order to reestablish a secure connection. And it also actually incidentally solves part of the other problem, which is if you change your IP address one of them, not both sides, but if one side changes, the quick system can recover from that, which introduces a solution to mobility where IP addresses change as a consequence of that. What's your opinion on quantum computers? Well, I'm actually quite excited about the computers. We've invested heavily in those at Google, and there's every indication that if you could get a large enough quantum computer with sufficient amounts of correction capability, error correction capability, there are some really tough optimization problems that you can solve quickly that you could not solve in a reasonable amount of time on a conventional machine. But it's turning out to be really, really hard to get all the pieces together and at a scale that's meaningful. That's why you're hearing more and more about quantum internet, which I sort of dismissed for a while as somebody just jamming a couple of buzzwords together. In fact, though, it may turn out to be the only way you can build a large enough collection of qubits working together, because there are limits to the physical size of a quantum computer that we can build, at least with today's technology. So imagine the only way to scale up the number of qubits that are interacting with each other is to build multiple computers and interconnect them in such a way that the quantum information in photons is preserved well enough and can be relayed well enough so as to bind multiple quantum machines together to do an aggregated computation. Well, it's now 10 minutes to 7. I think maybe we need to stop here. But as I say, please send me the questions that we didn't get to and others that you might want to address, me to try to address, and I'll do the best I can and may have to dribble out, a little bit at a time. But thank you so much for letting me just rattle on for well over an hour. I appreciate the opportunity, and I look forward to another opportunity to get together, especially to talk about the IoT things.
Well, Vint, we can't thank you enough for taking time out of your busy schedule to share this evening with us and all your thoughts and experiences and discuss the challenges, but most importantly, I think the opportunities. And so I want to thank everybody that participated. Certainly, I want to thank all the people that made this event possible, including the Marconi Society, the Cleveland Foundation, both universities, Case Western Reserve University and Cleveland State University, and all of the other partners that help support and make sure that we could have a good and I think a very joyful event. And so, Vint, I can't thank you enough for taking the time and spending it with us.
Well, thanks so much. I certainly enjoyed it, and I look forward to another opportunity.
Okay.
All right. Take care, everybody.
Okay. Thanks, everybody. Thanks. Stay safe and healthy.
Yes, right. Wash your hands, wear your mask, and, stay separated from each other until you get your shots.
Exactly. Okay. Thanks, everybody.
Bye-bye for now.